The wind howled over the cracked clapboard of Hawthorne Homestead as if it were a mournful choir, each gust striking the peeling paint like a drumbeat in an abandoned church. The roof sagged, its shingles curling like old skin, and when rain struck the warped eaves, it poured not into the gutters, but into the creaking joists below, pooling on the floorboards with a slow, relentless drip that marked time against the walls. Liam stood at the threshold of the front door, his hand resting on the cold iron latch. The house loomed before him, a silhouette of decay against the grey sky. He could feel the dampness seep into his bones, the scent of mildew and rust mingling with the faint sweetness that lingered from a long-gone summer harvest. Every creak in the floorboards seemed to echo his own heartbeat, a metronome ticking toward an inevitable collapse. The obstacle lay not merely in the crumbling structure, but in what it represented, a false refuge that promised shelter, yet offered only silence and stagnation. The house was a cage of its own making. Its walls held memories as tightly as they held dust, each crack a confession of neglect, each broken window a reminder that he had chosen to live within these confines. He took a breath that tasted of earth and old wood, the air thick with the promise of storm. Liam turned his back on the door and walked into the living room, where a sagging sofa creaked under the weight of an unseen presence. He moved to the kitchen, his feet sinking into the warped floorboards that groaned beneath each step. The stove, once bright and humming, now lay dormant, its burners cold as stone. He set a pot on the stove, filled it with water from the tap, water that ran slow, thick with mineral taste, and turned on the flame. Choice was a hard line drawn in the dust of his mind, to accept the silence that threatened to swallow him or to carve out a routine that could keep the house alive. Liam chose the latter. He began with the basics: water for the plants, feed for the chickens, the rhythm of turning over the soil. He measured each task by the tick of an old brass clock he had salvaged from the attic, its hands stubbornly moving forward, even as the world outside seemed to stand still. The routine became a lifeline, a tether that pulled him away from the abyss of the house's decay. Each chore was performed with a precision that mirrored his desire for control. He trimmed the overgrown hedges until their edges were clean and sharp. He mended the broken porch railings with strips of weathered wood, each nail hammered into place like a prayer. The rhythm of these actions became a mantra, a way to keep the storm's roar at bay. Yet as the days stretched, so did his isolation. In the quiet hours, when the wind howled through cracked windows and rain drummed against the roof, Liam felt the weight of solitude pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He would stare at the peeling paint, imagining the stories it could tell, if only someone listened. The house was no longer just a shelter. It became an echo chamber for his own thoughts, amplifying the silence until it grew deafening. The consequence unfolded in small, insidious ways. His mind began to wander through corridors of guilt and regret, haunted by the memories that clung to every corner of the homestead. The routine he had established, once a shield, now became a prison. He could no longer step outside the walls of his own making without feeling as though he were stepping into a storm unprepared. The isolation deepened until even the birds' songs seemed distant and muffled. Liam found himself speaking to the house itself, whispering words that carried nowhere but back into the empty rooms. The silence became a presence that followed him like a shadow, reminding him of every mistake made in his past life, a life he had tried to leave behind as surely as he abandoned the old farm. When night fell and the storm surged outside, the house seemed to breathe with him, its walls groaning under the pressure of wind and rain. Liam sat at the kitchen table, a single candle flickering against the darkness, the flame trembling like his own heartbeat. The routine that had once felt like salvation now felt like a trap. Each task was a reminder of what he had lost and could never regain. He stared into the dim light, the storm raging beyond the cracked windows. and wondered if this fragile routine, this narrow line between survival and surrender, was enough to keep him from falling entirely into the abyss. The house, with all its decay, stood as a testament to his own fragility and resilience, but it also whispered that every choice he made was a step deeper into isolation. Would a man who has chosen to live in a place of ruin ever find the courage to open the door to another's light? The wind had already begun to claw at the cracked windows of Hawthorne Homestead when Liam pulled the old iron rod that held up the porch railings back into place. The metal groaned like a dying animal, and he set it down with a clatter that seemed louder than the storm outside. Dust swirled in the shafts of light, cutting through the gloom. Each mote was a ghost of the house's former life. He walked to the kitchen where the stove was still a relic of better days, its enamel chipped and splattered with rust. The wood floor creaked under his boots as he carried a bucket of water from the cracked well in the backyard. The sound echoed through the empty rooms like a drumbeat of survival. Liam's hands were steady, his thoughts were not. He was building a fortress out of chores, each task a brick in an invisible wall that kept him from stepping outside into the world he had abandoned. When the rain hammered against the roof, Liam climbed the ladder to the attic. The hatch was hidden behind a stack of old barrels. He pulled it open with a sigh that was half relief and half resignation. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust motes that danced in the beam from the single window. He turned on his lantern, its yellow glow casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The attic smelled of mildew and forgotten memories. As he lifted the floorboards to reach the hatch, a sudden rush of wind seemed to carry something else. A whisper of voices, distant but unmistakable. Liam froze. The echo was faint, like a sermon whispered through stone walls. He could almost hear the preacher's voice, booming in his ears, calling him back to a past that had burned away with every lie he'd told himself. The memory unfurled. Elias Blackwood, tall and stern, standing before an empty pulpit under a dim chandelier. His words were sharp as knives, cutting through the silence of the chapel. You who have turned your heart towards sin, you must return to the path that leads to redemption. Liam felt the sting of those words, as if they had been carved into his skin. The house seemed to close in around him. The attic was a mausoleum for his regrets. He swallowed hard and forced himself to focus on the task at hand. He set the lantern down, placed the bucket beside it, and began to scrub the floorboards with a rag that had seen better days. His fingers worked mechanically, moving from one board to another, as if the motion could erase the echo of Elias's sermon. The water from the bucket hissed against the cracked tiles, the sound a steady metronome that steadied his breathing. He remembered the smell of rain on dry earth, the taste of dirt in his mouth when he had first come to this place. The chores were simple: sweep, mop, mend the broken window, repair the sagging porch railings. Each action was an attempt to bind himself to the present, to keep the storm's howl from reaching his mind. But as he worked, the memory of Elias Blackwood grew louder. It seeped into the corners of his thoughts like ivy on stone. He could feel the weight of his past sins pressing down on him, a heavy cloak that he could not shed even with the effort of his hands. The more he scrubbed, the deeper the wound seemed to go. The scar in his conscience widened, stretching across his chest like a canyon. When he finally set the rag aside, the attic was silent again, save for the drip of water from the leaky roof. He stood there, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floorboards that had been scrubbed until they gleamed faintly. The silence felt oppressive, a reminder that his attempts to suppress the memory were futile. He could feel the emotional wound tightening around him like a vice, squeezing more and more of his soul with each passing moment. The storm outside intensified. Thunder rolled across the sky, and lightning cracked the darkness in jagged lines. Liam looked up at the ceiling, where the rafters seemed to lean toward the heavens, as if pleading for release. He could not help but wonder whether the chores he performed were a futile attempt to keep his mind from wandering back to that sermon, or whether they were a necessary ritual of survival. He turned away from the attic and walked back down the stairs. The hallway smelled of mildew and old wood. Each step sounded like a drumbeat in the silence. He paused at the front door, feeling the cold metal of the latch against his palm. The storm raged outside, but inside he was still alone, surrounded by the walls that held his past. Would this relentless routine be enough to keep the echo of Elias Blackwood from tearing him apart? The stone walls of the cellar pressed close around him like a second skin, damp and cold, the air thick with the musk of earth and forgotten rain. He had crawled into this narrow chamber only to mend a cracked pipe that threatened to swallow the foundation whole. The hatch in the attic, hidden by warped boards and years of neglect, had opened to reveal a world below, a world he believed was empty, save for his own echoing footsteps. But as the wind howled outside, rattling the sagging porch railings, something else moved in that dark, damp space. A faint tread, soft as wet moss, traced a line across the rough stone. Liam's breath caught. He had never expected the house to harbour more than rust and rot, yet here, under the weight of years, a presence lingered. His fingers tightened on the wrench, knuckles blanching against the cold metal. The footprints were shallow, as if someone had walked on damp earth that had not dried. They led deeper into the cellar, away from the familiar corners he knew by heart. He could feel the pulse of his own heartbeat in his ears, a drumbeat that matched the rhythm of the storm outside. He hesitated, his first hesitation in weeks, when the house itself seemed to be breathing in silence and the memories of past sins pressed against him like a vice. He could retreat back up the hatch, leave the footprints untouched, keep his solitude intact, keep the fragile order he had imposed upon this crumbling refuge. But the line tugged at something deeper, an instinct that whispered there was more to this place than the decay it showed. He slipped on his worn boots, the soles squeaking against stone, and stepped forward into the darkness. The footprints grew thicker, the scent of wet earth stronger. He could not help but wonder who had left them. A child? An animal? A man? Yet there was no sound, only the muffled thud of his own steps echoing through the hollow. The cellar walls seemed to close in around him as he followed, each stone bearing silent testimony to years of neglect. The path wound like a river through forgotten corners, leading to a small alcove where a single beam of moonlight pierced the gloom from a crack in the ceiling. In that alcove lay a small wooden box, its lid ajar, revealing a handful of old photographs. Smiling faces caught mid-laugh, a wedding band tarnished by time. Liam's chest tightened. He'd been so focused on repairing the house, on keeping his routine unbroken, that he had forgotten what it was to see life in the midst of ruin. The box felt like a relic, a piece of another story, perhaps even his own lost past. He reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed against the photographs. The dust settled, and for a moment the house seemed less a prison and more a witness to something fragile and hopeful. He realized that his solitude had been a shell, protecting him from the truth he had buried beneath layers of routine. The footprints were not a threat, but an invitation, a call to step beyond the walls of his own making. He lifted the lid higher, revealing more images. A young woman in a white dress, standing beside a farmhouse similar to this one, her eyes bright with possibility. He felt the weight of his own isolation lift ever so slightly, as if those faces were echoing back at him, reminding him that he was not alone in this vast, indifferent world. When he closed the lid, the cellar seemed less ominous and more alive. The storm outside grew louder, a reminder that life, wild, untamed, relentless, continued beyond his thresholds. He turned back toward the hatch, the footprints still visible beneath the damp stone, a silent promise of companionship in the most unlikely place. Would he ever again let the house be merely a shelter, or would this new connection rewrite the rules he had set for himself? The night had settled over Hawthorne Homestead like a thick blanket, yet within its walls a low, guttural sound pulsed, an echo that seemed to come from the very bones of the house. Liam stood at the threshold of the attic hatch, his back against the warped frame, breath shallow, as if he were trying not to disturb whatever lay beneath. The storm cellar's stone walls loomed in the dim glow of a single lantern, their cold surfaces reflecting the flicker like a silent warning. The sound was not a wind through broken windows. It was a shout distorted by distance and age, carrying a cadence that felt both alien and familiar. It had come from somewhere within the house, perhaps the cellar or the attic itself, but its source could not be pinpointed. A shiver ran up Liam's spine as he listened to the echo reverberate through the rafters, each repetition growing louder with the passing seconds. Elias Blackwood was not a man who would simply vanish into the night. He had left his own mark on the land, long before Liam had set foot on these acres. The very walls of Hawthorne Homestead seemed to hold his presence, an oppressive memory of a preacher's stern rebuke that had once haunted Liam's thoughts. Now in the silence of the attic, that same voice returned, twisted and warped by the darkness. Liam did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched, hidden behind a cracked panel of wood, his eyes narrowed to slits as he tried to locate the source of the shout. The sound ricocheted off stone and timber, bouncing back into the attic in a way that made him feel as if the house itself was breathing. The choice before Liam was stark: confront Elias Blackwood or avoid the confrontation entirely by remaining hidden in this narrow corner. He remembered the stories of cultists who stalked these fields at night, their motives shrouded in darkness and desperation. The thought of facing such a man alone sent a cold wave through his veins. Yet he also knew that retreating would only give Elias more time to plant his influence deeper into the very soil he was trying to protect. He decided, with a resolve that felt almost desperate, to stay hidden. He did not want to provoke an attack that could have cost him more than just his life. He wanted to gather information first. The sound continued to echo, growing in intensity, as if Elias himself were shouting from within the walls of the storm cellar. The consequence was immediate and chilling. Liam felt a cold wind sweep through the attic, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and something metallic, perhaps blood, that made his stomach churn. The shout became louder, more urgent, as though someone, or something, was pounding against the hidden hatch, demanding entry. It seemed that whatever danger was lurking inside the storm cellar had found a way to communicate through the house itself. A sense of dread flooded Liam's chest, tightening like iron bands around his heart. He could no longer deny that the homestead he had fought so hard to repair was not merely a shelter, it was a battleground. The very walls that offered him refuge now echoed with threats and promises of ruin. The fear that Elias Blackwood might soon step through the hatch, or that the cultists who followed him would find their way into his sanctuary, grew like a shadow lengthening across the floorboards. The attic's lantern sputtered, its flame trembling as if in response to the unseen presence below. Liam realized that the storm cellar was no longer just an old shelter. It had become a symbol of hidden truths and desperate hopes, a place where past sins might finally be confronted. He could feel his own guilt, his lingering shame from the preacher's rebuke, mirroring the darkness that now pressed against him. The echo faded as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to swallow the very sound of his breathing. Liam's heart beat so hard he could hear it in his ears. The silence felt like a pause before a storm that would soon break over Hawthorne Homestead. He knew now that the danger was not only confirmed, but imminent. Every creak of the old house, every breath of wind through the cracked windows carried the weight of Elias Blackwood's looming presence. The choice to hide had bought him time, but it also meant he would have to confront this threat sooner rather than later. The question hung in the air, as heavy as the dust motes dancing in the lantern light. Could Liam's quiet vigilance be enough to shield Hawthorne Homestead from the darkness that has seeped into its very foundations? The storm had turned the sky into a bruised bruise of grey, its wind rattling the sagging porch railings like an old man's fingers tapping against a cracked window pane. Inside, the house seemed to breathe with a slow, oppressive sigh. Every creak was a reminder that the walls were still holding together despite their peeling paint and leaking roof. Liam sat on the warped floorboards of the cellar, his back hunched over a rusted bucket as he mended a cracked pipe. The flicker of a single bulb cast long, wavering shadows across the stone walls, making them look like ancient, tired eyes watching him. He'd been here for weeks, each day a repetition of the same work, fixing leaks, clearing debris, listening to the wind outside that seemed eager to pry into his solitude. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew, but in that dimness something else hovered, a quiet, hesitant presence that did not belong to the house. It was Aurora. Her footprints had been soft, almost feathered against the stone, a silent trail leading deeper into the cellar's heart. He followed them, his footsteps echoing off the walls like whispered secrets. She appeared at the far end of the alcove, where old photographs lay scattered across a cracked wooden table. The images were weathered, faces faded to grey, but their eyes still seemed to stare up at him from the past. Aurora had stepped out from behind a stack of tarps, her hair tangled with leaves and her clothes stained by the damp earth. Her shoulders shook with the effort of holding herself together in that place of ruin. The obstacle was clear. She confronted him, not with words, but with a look that held more than sorrow. It carried an urgency born of desperation. She lifted a hand to his shoulder, not as a gesture of aggression, but as a plea for shelter. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering light and the storm outside. In her gaze, Liam saw a mirror of his own isolation, two souls adrift in a world that had turned its back on them. He could have dismissed her as another wanderer, another lost soul seeking refuge in an abandoned house. He could have let the wind carry her away, letting her disappear into the night. But the obstacle was not merely her presence, it was the weight of her past, the unspoken story that tugged at his own memories of guilt and regret. The choice he made was small, yet profound. He reached for a tin can of beans, one of the few foodstuffs left in the cellar, and opened it with a careful twist. The scent of canned meat wafted up, a sharp contrast to the dampness that clung to the stone. He lifted a spoon and offered it to her, his hands steady despite the tremor that shook him from within. She took the spoon with hesitant fingers, eyes flicking between his face and the food. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she accepted the offering, a silent acknowledgement of the gesture's significance. Liam's heart thudded against his ribs. He felt the weight of every decision that had led him to this moment, each one a stone in the path that now seemed to lead toward a fragile alliance. The consequence unfolded slowly, like the slow drip of rain through a cracked roof. As she ate, their eyes met for a brief second, an exchange of unspoken understanding that bridged the gap between stranger and companion. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the quiet hum of the storm outside and the faint creak of the house settling around them. Liam listened as Aurora whispered about her past, a ruined marriage, a life shattered by betrayal and loss. Her voice trembled like the wind rattling the porch railings, yet there was an undercurrent of resolve that made his own fear feel less absolute. She spoke not to accuse him, but to share her need for safety, her hope for a place where she could breathe without being watched. In that moment, the house seemed to hold its breath with them. The old storm cellar, once a sanctuary against tornadoes, became a confessional chamber where two broken people found common ground in their shared isolation. Liam felt the first stirrings of trust bloom like a fragile flower amidst the decay, an ember that could either die or ignite into something brighter. The alliance was not forged by grand gestures, but by small acts. A spoonful of beans, a listening ear, the shared silence under a storm's roar. It was an agreement written in the margins of their lives, a pact to endure the coming night together, to face whatever Elias Blackwood might bring with him. And as the wind howled outside, rattling the porch railings and whispering through the cracked windows, Liam wondered if this fragile alliance would be enough to shield them from the darkness that waited beyond the house's worn thresholds. The storm had turned from a distant rumble into a ferocious howl that rattled the clappered walls of Hawthorne Homestead, each gust hurling rain against the peeling paint like an angry hand. Inside the stone-walled cellar, Liam's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he listened to the echo of footsteps above, footsteps that were not his own. The heavy, iron-bound hatch that had once been a refuge from tornadoes now felt more like a coffin, its lid creaking with every tremor. Elias Blackwood's voice, low and insistent, seeped through the floorboards, each syllable dripping with menace. "You think you can hide in these crumbling walls? Your sins are not buried here. They will be exposed to all who hear my words." The preacher's words were a blade that sliced through the thin air, cutting into Liam's resolve. Liam's hands trembled as he gripped the rough stone of the cellar wall. His mind, already a battlefield of guilt and fear, now faced a new adversary, Elias's intent to turn the world against him. The preacher's plan was clear: publicly shame Liam, expose the secrets that had driven him to this isolated farmhouse, and strip him of any remaining dignity. The obstacle weighed heavily. Elias's men would come in the morning, armed with the preacher's rhetoric and a weaponized faith that could turn neighbors into zealots. The homestead's dilapidated state offered no real protection. The roof leaked, the porch railings sagged, and the storm cellar was the only place where Liam might hope to conceal himself and Aurora. His choice loomed before him like a cliff edge. He could stand idle, let the preacher's words echo in his mind until dawn, and risk being caught unprepared. Or he could act now, fortifying the cellar with what little resources he had left: wood from the fallen porch beams, broken panes of glass, the old iron hinges that still clung to their metal frames. He would lock the hatch tighter, reinforce the stone walls with splintered boards, and hide Aurora beneath a heap of debris that could shield her from both the storm's fury and Elias's men. Liam moved with a sudden, urgent precision. The cellar was a narrow tunnel, but he treated it as a battlefield. He carried a battered wooden crate of old tools, dragging it into the dark. With a grunt, he wedged splintered boards against the hatch, then pressed them firmly into place, shoring up the structure that had once been a sanctuary for tornadoes. Every hammer strike reverberated through the stone, a rhythmic drumbeat of defiance. He fetched broken panes of glass from the attic, shards that glittered like fractured stars in the dim light, and placed them around the hatch's frame. The shards caught the weak glow of his flashlight, turning the cellar into a jagged, reflective maze. He stacked old tarps and rags over the boards, creating layers of insulation against both rain and prying eyes. Then he turned to Aurora, who had been huddled in the corner beside him, her shoulders hunched as if she could absorb the storm's wrath. Liam lifted her gently, cradling her against his chest. "We're not alone," he whispered, voice low, almost a prayer. He tucked her into the space between the boards and tarps, her small body hidden beneath the debris that would muffle any noise. The consequence of his actions settled over him like a heavy blanket. The cellar was no longer merely a shelter. It had become an engineered fortress, its walls bristling with makeshift armor. Aurora's presence, once a fragile alliance born of shared silence and beans, now solidified into a partnership forged in the crucible of impending danger. Their eyes met, hers wide with fear, his resolute, and they understood that their survival depended on each other. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the roof, wind howling through broken windows like mournful wolves. Inside, Liam's heart pounded as he listened to distant footsteps, the echo of a preacher's voice rising in a crescendo of judgment. He knew that when dawn broke and Elias's men would descend upon Hawthorne Homestead, his choices here would determine whether they could withstand the onslaught or be crushed beneath it. Would this desperate fortification be enough to shield them from the preacher's wrath? The cellar walls, once cool and stone-bound, grew hot under a sudden breath of wind that rattled the attic hatch. Elias Blackwood's silhouette slipped into the dimness, his knife glinting like a shard of moonlight against the jagged stones. The metal sang a thin, cruel note as he stepped closer, every foot echoing in the cramped space where Liam had once found only silence. Liam stood at the threshold of that sanctuary, hands clenched around a rusted shovel that had become his last vestige of control. He could feel the weight of the knife, cold, unforgiving, and the cold certainty of Elias's intent. The air tasted metallic, thick with the smell of damp earth and the faint scent of pine from the cracked ceiling. His breath came shallow, each exhale was a hiss against the stone. Elias's voice, low and rasping, cut through the silence. "You think you can hide in this broken house, Liam? You think your sins are buried with these walls?" He raised the knife, its edge catching the weak light that seeped from the hatch. The blade was a promise of violence, a threat wrapped in words. Liam's throat tightened. He had survived the storm, he had fortified the cellar, and yet here stood the man who had once preached redemption with a twisted grin. "You're wrong," Liam said, his voice rough as gravel. The words were not just an answer, they were a defiance that reverberated off stone. The obstacle lay in Elias's presence, his knife, his threat, the echo of past sermons turned to menace. Liam chose to confront, not with fists, but with fire, an unyielding verbal defense that rattled the very foundation of the cellar. He spoke of storms, of broken roofs, of how every cracked pane was a reminder that even decay could shelter. His words were a shield, his voice a blade sharper than any steel. Elias laughed, a sound like breaking twigs. "You think your stories can stop me?" he hissed, lunging forward. The knife flashed, cutting the air with a staccato rhythm. Liam twisted, the shovel slipping from his grip as he tried to block the strike. The stone walls seemed to groan under the pressure of their clash. The consequence unfolded like a slow-motion collapse. The cellar's narrowness turned into a cage. Each blow sent vibrations through the floorboards that had once supported the porch railings. A loose plank shivered, then gave way, splintering against Liam's arm as he braced himself. Dust rose in spirals, settling on the walls like a grim veil. Elias's knife found its target, not in Liam's flesh, but in his resolve. He pressed the blade to Liam's throat, the cold metal biting into the skin that had weathered years of hardship. The cellar trembled as a storm outside roared louder, wind howling through broken rafters, rattling the attic hatch like a dying heart. Liam stared at the knife, eyes reflecting the flickering shadows. He could feel his own breath, shallow and frantic, mixing with the scent of wet stone and metal. The words he had spoken earlier, his defiance, now seemed both a shield and a spark that could ignite the cellar into chaos. Every movement was a dance between survival and surrender. The walls creaked as the storm intensified, the rain hammering against the roof, sending splinters down like shards of broken promises. The confrontation spilled into chaos. The stone walls cracked, a fissure opening near the hatch, revealing the dark sky outside. The cellar's safety dissolved with each crack, each scream that echoed through the hollow. In that moment, the homestead, once a symbol of false refuge, shuddered under the weight of its own decay. Liam's choice to speak, to stand his ground, had set in motion a chain reaction that threatened not only his life, but the fragile hope he and Aurora clung to. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside. Both were relentless, unyielding. Would this final act of defiance be enough to protect the girl? The cellar floor, once a mosaic of old wood and stubborn boards, had turned into a slick river of molten iron. A hiss, low as a throat clearing, seeped through the stone walls. Elias Blackwood's explosives had found their match in the damp earth. The air grew heavy, a metallic tang mingling with the acrid scent of burning timber. Every breath felt like inhaling embers. Each exhale was a plume of smoke that curled and twisted, dancing around the jagged edges of the cracked stone. Liam's heart hammered against his ribs as if it were a drum in an abandoned church. He could hear his own pulse echoing off the walls, a frantic rhythm that matched the crackling flames licking at the rafters. The cellar had been their last bastion, the fragile fortress he and Aurora had built together with boards, glass shards and tarps, a testament to survival forged in desperation. Now it was collapsing under the weight of fire. The first spark erupted from a collapsed section of the ceiling where an old pipe had burst, sending a sheet of flame across the far wall. The fire spread like a hungry beast, licking the boards that had once held them together. Smoke curled into spirals, obscuring the dim glow of their makeshift lanterns. Every crack in the stone seemed to pulse with heat. The walls groaned as if in agony. Liam felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. The cellar's foundation was already weakened by the storm that had hammered the roof above. Now, with fire consuming the very bones of the structure, the air grew thinner, more oppressive. He knew the cellar would give way at any moment. The collapse would be sudden and merciless. He turned toward Aurora, who sat on a rickety stool, her hair tangled in a damp mess that clung to her face like soot. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering flames. She stared at him, not with fear, but with a silent plea, an unspoken request for safety, for something beyond this crumbling refuge. Liam's gaze swept over the room, the broken boards, the charred walls, the small pool of water that had gathered in the corner from melted ice. He felt the weight of every decision he'd made since arriving at Hawthorne Homestead settle upon him like a stone. Every choice to stay, to fight, to protect had led him here. Now, as the flames threatened to consume them both, his mind narrowed to one brutal truth. There was only one way forward. He raised a hand, palm open, not in warning, but in an offering of urgency. Aurora's eyes flicked to him, her lips pressed into a thin line. In that instant, time seemed to stretch. Every second stretched like a thread pulled taut between the fire and the walls. He did not speak. Words would have been swallowed by the roar of flames. The first crack in the stone wall sounded as if it were a gunshot. The ceiling gave way with a thunderous groan, sending a shower of splinters down upon them. Liam lunged forward, his arm reaching for Aurora's shoulder. She was startled, her body tensing as she braced against the sudden impact. He grasped her wrist with a grip that was both fierce and gentle, his fingers digging into her skin, a tactile promise of protection. The ground beneath their feet trembled more violently. A sheet of fire broke through the ceiling above them, searing the air with blistering heat. The flame licked at Liam's jacket, singeing the hem as it passed over his shoulder. He could feel the burn on his skin, a sharp sting that sent shivers up his spine. Yet he did not flinch. Instead, he pulled Aurora toward the narrow passageway that led to the attic hatch, a path that had once been a secret escape from storms. The hallway was dimly lit by the weak glow of their lanterns, but now the flames reflected off the cracked plaster, turning the walls into a mosaic of orange and red. The air tasted of charred wood. Each breath was a struggle to keep lungs clear of smoke. Liam's hands were slick with sweat and soot, yet he moved with a determined grace that belied the chaos around him. They reached the hatch, a small stone door hidden behind a rusted curtain of ivy. It had been their last hope for escape, a forgotten passage that Elias Blackwood had once used to flee after sermons gone wrong. The hatch was cold beneath Liam's fingers. It felt like a relic from another time, a silent witness to past sins and present salvation. Liam shoved the hatch open with all his strength. The sudden rush of air hit them like a wave, cool and sharp against their faces. Aurora inhaled deeply, her lungs filling with fresh air that smelled faintly of earth and rain, an aroma that seemed almost foreign after the acrid smoke. She turned to Liam, her eyes glistening with tears that mingled with soot. Behind them, the cellar erupted in a final roar as the remaining walls gave way. A massive chunk of stone collapsed onto the floor, sending a shower of ash and debris into the air. The ground shook so violently that the stones on the floor trembled like a living thing. Liam felt the impact through his boots. He could hear the distant crackle of flames consuming what had been their sanctuary. He did not look back. He dragged Aurora out of the hatch, pulling her with him as if she were a precious cargo in a ship sailing toward unknown waters. Their feet struck the attic floor, dry, dusty, and surprisingly intact despite the chaos below. The attic was a cavernous space, filled with old trunks, abandoned furniture, and the remnants of a life that had once thrived here. It smelled of mildew and forgotten memories. Liam held Aurora close as they made their way up the narrow ladder that led to the roof. Each rung creaked under his weight. Each step was a reminder of the fragility of life and the strength required to survive it. The storm outside roared with a ferocity that seemed to echo the turmoil within him, a storm of guilt, regret, and the desperate hope for redemption. They reached the roof just as the last of the cellar's walls collapsed, sending a final cascade of rubble down into the darkness below. Liam pressed his back against the cold wooden railing, breathing heavily. The wind whipped around them, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth and the distant sound of thunder that rolled over the hills. Aurora looked up at him, her face illuminated by the flickering light of a distant lightning strike. She saw in his eyes a mixture of exhaustion and fierce determination, a man who had chosen to sacrifice his own refuge for another's safety. He was no longer the man who had once feared the storm. He was now a beacon of hope amid ruin. The fire below continued its slow, inevitable descent into the earth, but Liam stood firm on the roof, his heart beating steady, his resolve unshaken. The weight of his sacrifice settled upon him like a mantle. He had given up his sanctuary, his last line of defense, to save Aurora from certain death. In that moment he understood that redemption was not a place to be found, but a choice made in the face of overwhelming darkness. The scene ends with a question hanging heavy in the air, a rhetorical echo that invites reflection on the cost and meaning of Liam's sacrifice. Would this final act of defiance be enough to protect the girl? The cellar was a stone-walled womb, its narrow corridor dimmed by the flicker of dying candles that had been lit in frantic attempts to keep the blaze at bay. The air smelled of wet earth and charred timber. Every breath tasted of ash. Above, the rafters groaned as the roof gave way to the relentless storm outside, water dripping like a slow, metallic rain onto the cracked floor. Elias Blackwood stood at the far end of the corridor, his silhouette sharp against the glow of the fire he had set with reckless intent. His eyes were narrowed, focused on Liam, who hovered inches from the collapsed wall, the edge of his own body bruised and bleeding from the earlier struggle. The knife in Elias's hand was a gleaming promise of death. The blade reflected the orange light of the flames, a silver serpent poised to strike. The obstacle lay not only in the physical trap that had been set by the collapse, but also in the psychological abyss that both men occupied. Liam felt the weight of every decision he had made since arriving at Hawthorne Homestead. He had built a fragile sanctuary here, yet it was now crumbling under the weight of his past and the threat of Elias's wrath. Elias lunged first, knife flashing. The blade found its mark in the back of Liam's shoulder, a searing pain that spread like wildfire through his veins. Yet instead of reacting with violence, Liam stepped forward, his hands outstretched, palm open as if to offer something beyond the physical realm. He did not raise his own weapon. He raised his voice, low and steady. "You think you can end this? You are already dead inside." The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge between two enemies. Elias's face twisted with rage, but the fire of their shared past flickered briefly before being swallowed by the darkness that surrounded them. Liam's choice was not to fight back with a blade or a gun. It was to give himself up entirely, to let the knife cut through his chest and into the stone wall beneath him. He understood that his sacrifice would break the cycle of violence, allowing Aurora, who had been hidden in a side chamber, to escape. The thought that burned within him was not of glory, but of absolution. He pressed his back against the wall, feeling the knife's edge graze the bone. Pain surged through him like a tide. yet he could feel the air shift as if someone else's life began to breathe where his had ceased. He let the blade sink into the stone, and the sound was not a crunch, but a sigh, a release of tension that reverberated through the cellar. Elias recoiled, stunned by the sudden stillness. The knife clattered against the floor, its metal glinting in the firelight. In that instant, the cavernous space opened as if it were a living thing exhaling. A fissure formed in the wall where Liam's body had become the conduit of his sacrifice. From that crack, light seeped through, and the sound of water rushing past the old storm cellar's entrance was heard, a signal that the path to escape was now clear. Aurora, who had been trembling behind a stack of timber, saw the opening and seized it with both hands. She slipped through the gap, her small frame disappearing into darkness. The weight of her eyes met Liam's for a brief second, an unspoken gratitude that shivered across his chest even as his body went still. The final consequence unfolded in silence. The flames that had been licking the walls began to die down, their embers sputtering like dying stars. The storm outside slowed, the wind ceased its mournful howl. In the dim glow of the cellar, Liam's form lay motionless, a testament to the ultimate act of redemption. Aurora emerged from the hidden hatch, her face pale but alive, stepping into an uncertain future that was no longer bound by the shackles of his past. Would this final act of defiance be enough to protect the girl?